Season 8 just dropped with a ton of tank updates. Mauga is new to the roster and a lot of changes are being made, mostly being buffs. The last two season launch patches both made a massive shift happen in the meta, with Orisa Bastion for Season 6 and Sigma Mei for Season 7. So let's get right into what's changing in the tank tier list for Season 8. Starting at the bottom. In F tier, we have the solitary Wrecking Ball. He's still here, no thanks at all to the previous two lukewarm buffs to his primary fire. If I were to give a number value to how much impact those changes had, they've made him less than 5% better overall. It's not looking good. This is a patch that's buffed several tanks to improve their performance, and Wrecking Ball is not among them. Usually it's best to nerf heroes and abilities that hold low pick rate characters down, instead of overbuffing those characters to compensate for their weaknesses. It's pretty crazy that Ball is the one hero who still needs buffs to make him playable in 5v5, and he hasn't received any sort of advantage to help him keep up with the state of the game, at least for right now. Dive is already being played way more often, and with some of the changes for this season, you can expect it way more. But Ball just doesn't have enough advantages to be played over other dive heroes, and his disadvantages are way too many to count. Even Sombra's new EMP is especially effective against Ball. One of the only good things going in Overwatch 2 for Ball is that Sombra can no longer turbo counter him by just hacking him all the time out of his rolling form for 5 long seconds with her hacking EMP. Now that we're back to a longer lockout duration for the EMP, 3 seconds is a lot to not have any mobility as the easiest target in the game to hit. Having a literal circular target as a hitbox obviously makes you more vulnerable, even more so that Tracer's been buffed as well. Overall, damage is up, but Ball's durability and utility aren't, so he stays in F tier for now. If you're looking to grind to get better on tanks, use the link in the description to get access to a GameLeap membership, with guides for both mechanically intensive tanks like Doomfist and Jungle Queen on top of macro courses on how to best play Winston strategically. There's a lot of options for whatever hero you're trying to learn, so check it out and enjoy the video. Next up is Zarya, who's way luckier in D tier. Zarya is a way better pick compared to how bad Ball is, but she's still got a lot of weaknesses that make her hard to play in a lot of situations. Bubbling a DPS on the enemy backline is still a strong move, but why bubble them when you can literally jump in with them as a dive tank like Winston, Doom, or D.Va? Zarya's damage isn't even that crazy in the front line, since she gets most of her damage mitigated by the enemy tank. Getting high energy and rushing in fast can definitely score you some picks, and even just playing a slow, methodical Zarya around the objective isn't a bad style. It's just the fact that Zarya isn't especially good at any single one thing. She's a high damaging angle, she supports the dive, she peels her backline, and she can even tank important cooldowns and ultimates. The problem is that she has to do all of that with just one resource, her bubbles, and you're not even getting high energy against a lot of team compositions anyway. Without getting those buffs back on her projected bubble, she has a very small chance of being a solid meta pick. Just don't forget that even as the second worst tank right now, she's still a really decent hero, and is great for countering and matching against Matrix heroes like D.Va, Orisa, and Sigma. Now that he's received the small shield nerf, Zarya is way more viable into him. She is still super useful, sometimes. Reinhardt in C tier might seem a bit misplaced, but every other tank in the current patch has either become better overall or already was better overall in Season 7. Reinhardt kinda has a similar problem to Zarya. He can do a lot, anchor objective, deal damage, take damage, all the good tanking stuff, but he needs shield health to do so, much like how Zarya needs bubbles. The big difference between the two is that Ryan has a way bigger health pool to play with all the time, and his shield is regenerating super fast whenever it's down. Because of that, he can compete with higher damage based brawl comps, and can hold his own in every tank duel on the point for at least a good while. Zarya just cannot do that, and she straight up cannot tank damage outside of her bubble's flat rate of 200 health. But enough about Zarya. Ryan is in C tier. He can still punch up, but you're going to have to be playing him a lot better or just playing him into a good matchup. But the latter is based on how willing your opponents are to play counters and win. Despite Ryan being a good rounded pick, he can still be hard countered by high damage burst compositions, high ground angles, and flanks. There's not much Reinhardt can personally do for people outside of his area, so his impact is pretty minimal outside of the more sweatier lobbies that only happen rarely. Let's move on to B tier, starting off with Winston. Dealing full unmitigated damage against armor makes a big difference in a lot of his matchups, enough to make him a more viable overall pick, rather than just only in dive. Winston was really good just a couple seasons ago, so what actually changed that made him worse and now better again? The big answer is really just Bastion. Bastion became a really reliable must pick in Season 6 after receiving a lot of changes, but some of them were reverted afterwards. Right now, he's played a lot less, and with Winston's new change into armor, he does a lot more, but still not overpowered levels. It's not enough to focus the tank more with this new change, but it is a more viable option if you can't shoot anyone else, since you're at least doing your effective 60 damage per second. Brig and D.Va are the real targets for this change. The Brig matchup is pretty obvious. Winston wants to kill Brig, now he can do slightly more damage to Brig. Great. But for D.Va, it's got a lot to do with the health trades whenever you're playing the tank head to head. When you're getting chased by D.Va or just skirmishing with her on point, you can now deal a lot more damage to her in a longer duel. You'll still need to obviously jump away if she gets too close, but it's a lot harder for D.Va to chase you more aggressively, and you also build more ultimate charge off of her when she does. The same thing goes for other armored heroes that have a motive to get up in your face, like Ryan and Orisa. But remember, just because you now deal more damage to armor doesn't mean the hero is magically uncounterable. You'll still have to play slow, methodical, and pretty brutally for building your ultimate and executing a good engage on the backline. He's barely a good pick normally, but can be as amazing as before and even better with a lot of experience on him. You'll have to keep deaths pretend low and primal kills pretend high, but if you start pulling that off, he's definitely a strong pick. But even though he can be a strong pick, one of the reasons Winston can't get any higher than the bottom of B tier is thanks to the next hero, Roadhog. Now that good old Roadhog is a decent pick again, he's a way more viable pick to just counter dive tanks, and is even good at holding Reinhardt back with his high damage and low cooldown hook. He's a lot better than before, but not really in a creative new way. His heal is more flexible, so he just does the same thing that he did before, more often, without being punished as much. And the trap only helps him get more one-shots, it doesn't really allow him to take space. So he may be more annoying, but he still can't compete well against the top tanks, and he's very commonly weakened to Ana and Sojourn. He may be gatekeeping a lot of dive tanks, but he still loses out to both the brawling tanks and the spamming tanks. There's even a mix of both in Orisa, who may not hard counter him anymore, but can still gatekeep him from doing anything in the front line with her javelin. Tanks can beat him, DPS can beat him, supports can beat him. It's a lot of ways to get counter that doesn't help his viability, but he still has an insanely high skill ceiling. If you hit every hook, you will get rewarded no matter what. And with a high hook accuracy comes a high chance to win the game. It's just a question of what other options do better compared to him, and unfortunately there are just a lot of them in this patch. Next up is D.Va, a little bit lower this patch despite receiving regular buffs every once in a while. Not in this patch though, where a lot of other tanks are much stronger. D.Va's been relegated to more of a high-level counter pick. She's got the shotgun damage to mark tanks, and the defense matrix to mark damage and heals. She's even got the ability to counter snipers and chase flankers. She's still a really ultimate countering hero, she just doesn't have a lot of explosive power on the front line, nor does she ever have a massive power spike where she's nigh unstoppable. D.Va has to constantly play the game between being aggressive and defensive, so getting value out of D.Va starts at picking the right choice all the time. Sometimes that choice can be easy, like pushing and farming the enemy wrecking ball every time you find him, but sometimes it can be eating a pulse bomb for your backline at the right moment, meaning that you have to stay pretty defensive. Even though she has a high potential and is pretty strong right now, she still doesn't have the advantage over the better tanks right now. Starting with a fresh new face, Mauga tops the B tier rankings right off the bat, and in this case B is not average. Mauga was already a strong ranged and brawling tank when he was first playable in the BlizzCon free trial weekend, and with more changes to help him be more resilient in the frontline, he's easily a great new alternative for both brawl and poke styles. Cardiac Overdrive is a massively powerful ability that can reach unstoppable heights with good planning and setup for your engages. And his range damage is amazing despite looking like a close quarters guy on the surface. I don't want to overhype him, but there are a lot of tanks that he can farm crits on, and even more of them have to get into close range to finish the duel, exactly where Mauga deals the most damage, and subsequently buffs himself the most with his Berserker passive. He doesn't go any higher up because he is still a super massive dude that needs to commit to get value, unlike the slower playing Sigma and Orisa, but his slow game is still really strong enough to match up against a lot of top picks. Just two of his abilities are about engaging, so he definitely has to do it quite often. I'm pretty confident that he's great into Sigma and even other heroes with powerful stunts, thanks to the unstoppable effect on his overrun charge. It's an insanely strong ability to have. You can counter a lot of abilities just by using it reactively to make yourself CC immune. It's a lot of versatility for a new hero, and the numbers look real good. He's dealing good damage, but taking a lot of it too. If you're looking to make him work, stick to the discipline of using cover wisely. With such a big hitbox, you feed a lot every time you peek, so make sure you're not taking 300 damage to deal 100. Mauga is off to a good start, and he's actually really close to the next tank on the list. Up in A tier, the new Ramatra. His Omnic form damage is great and makes him a way bigger threat outside of his Nemesis form. It's pretty timely too, since his Nemesis form is pretty weak to Mauga, but his Omnic form can definitely keep up, especially with 5 seconds of shielding to stave off that high incendiary and critical damage. Ram's gotten some power creep of his own, and even though his Vortex could be more impactful, he has all the tools he needs to be a great mid-range tank that can actually get picks instead of just spamming the enemy tank. But hey, spamming the enemy tank is a common strategy because it's effective. Just put all your effective damage into the one big hitbox on the enemy team, and most of the time they can't heal at all. Luckily, when the game does get to that point, Ramatra has his really trusty 75% damage reduction block, and outside of Nemesis form, he can now keep up with his improved Omnic form. A damage and size increase for the projectiles also makes for more ult charge, and unlike Doomfist, there's no ultimate charge cost increase to compensate for the buff. Ram has gotten 2 great buffs in a row, and both of them are to his raw effectiveness as a hero with no drawbacks whatsoever. His matchup into Mauga isn't as good as it could be, but his overall viability is way better for sure. Just his shield alone is massive for blocking abilities and damage that Mauga just can't do. The brawl rivalry between Reinhardt and Ramatra might just be over with Ram taking this big of a step forward. But there's still the one-sided rivalry between Ram and Orisa. She's up next in a lower spot in A tier than before, mostly just because she's falling out of pick rate naturally. She is still a really strong hero and the go-to pick for high value with low effort, and the one-sided rivalry is obviously in her favor. Just Orisa's javelin is perfect for cancelling all sorts of aggro engages, and her damage is still top tier. Ram's poke may have been improved, but Orisa already had that decent consistent poke that's always great for pressuring tanks and suitable enough to duel the smaller targets when you need it. Just like D.Va, she's a great counter pick to a lot of heroes in the game, and even though she's still a top hero in that regard, she's not as popular nor as over-encumbering as before. I'm always a bit worried that the player base will realize how good she still is, but for now, don't tell anybody. I don't want to see her more than I already do. Closing in on the top 3 is a lot of familiar faces, starting with Doomfist. He's already strong and flexible, just weak to CC effects, even though he can dish out plenty of his own. Do ultimate change doesn't do anything to help that weakness, but it does amplify his ultimate engage, giving him more impact in one specific part of his kit. This is a nice way to make him feel more active and powerful in his groundbreaking ultimate dive. For a hero that's supposed to level skyscrapers, you should probably feel like it sometimes. Even though he has some bad matchups, his insane mobility allows him to escape any bad situation. It's what makes him actually viable despite having to play against Orisa and Roadhog pretty often. I see a lot of Doomfist players players get frustrated when their engages get fully peeled by easy healing. It's tilting for sure, but fully committing and then dying for it isn't the right response. Doom still belongs in A tier because of how flexible he is with his movement. He's got great damage too, especially against stacked teams, but you can't get full use of your damage and AoE abilities if you die trying to 1v2 backline. Top Doom play is difficult when you're playing against counters, but it's still possible enough and there are enough power spikes with your normal punch and powered punch and ultimate engage that you can make plenty of plays on your own with good positioning and execution. Just slamming the whole backline and shooting them from far away is a good play. He is definitely the most difficult to play out of the rest of the top heroes, and I can safely say that Ram is also an easier pick. He's harder to punish with his beefy Nemesis form. In the number 2 spot, still an A tier, Junker Queen takes a very confident second spot with her new completely unnecessary spread buff. It seems like every part of her kit has insane potential and her scattergun is no different. She also beats out a lot of the competition with another massive advantage, her skinny hitbox. Just take Mauga for example. Mauga can deal an insane amount of damage at close range, but his spread is a lot higher for it, meaning it won't be as accurate against smaller targets like Tracer, Kiriko, and bingo, Junker Queen. Queen's gotten a lot of mileage out of both the Carnage cooldown buff and the double bleed healing she got a while back, giving her a new clutch win condition outside of her ultimate with minimal to zero cooldown slashes back to back, and a lot of sustainability in the frontline when beefing with the other tank. And she still has clutch potential with her knife, and team buffing with her shout. She can be marked, but relatively to other tanks, her small hitbox makes a giant difference in how she can use her tempo and damage to her advantage to deal a ton of damage without taking it. And finally, the number 1 tank is still Sigma, but just barely. Don't be too discouraged. He's only a top pick for a while until everyone realizes they're just playing him for the sake of it. He's definitely no longer the best hero for every situation. He's definitely not being played so dominantly in lower ranks already, where Reinhardt's more favorable and definitely easier to get into. The shield regeneration nerf is super small, so Sigma is still the most rounded tank by far. But Queen, Ramatra, Mauga, Winston, and even Doomfist are all a lot better this season, and can really overwhelm Sigma and actually punish him, or even just ignore him and take out his backline. If you want to, you can 100% not play Sigma and still be fine this season, but he is still super consistent and it's always a bonus to play a hero that the general player base is used to playing around. Don't forget that Sigma is still really good at marking and dueling DPS and supports. He's just not as good at dueling all the tanks anymore. A lot of dive heroes are really good right now, just most players in most ranks have no clue how to execute with them properly. Despite having a high skill ceiling, Sigma just isn't as hard to get into. He's a popular pick because of that, and because people think he's the best pick at all times, but that is getting less true by the day as more tank options are becoming viable through just straight nitro boost buffing every tank every other patch. That's it for the tank tier list for Season 8. Let me know your feedback in the comments and how you're feeling about the new season. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.